Hi everyone, good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Burnout, What to Look Out For and What to Do. My name is Lauren Thomas and I am the CPD Program Officer with Central and Eastern Sydney PHN. I would firstly like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians and sovereign people on the land across which we work. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be joining us tonight. At the end of the webinar, the evaluation survey will pop up in the chat and also in your browsers. So please, we really appreciate your feedback, and that will allow us to do certificates of attendance. For any GPs who are joining us tonight, this is a self-report activity, so you'll need to upload those hours to your RSCGP dashboard. And any questions, you can submit them via the Q&A box and it'll be answered during at the end of the session. And we also have some upcoming events. Please check out our website and you can register via our website. We'll also be having some interactive polls tonight and asking some questions through the chat. So please feel free to provide your answers. And yeah, if you have any questions, we try and keep them to the Q&A. I would now like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Jo Braid, who's a rehabilitation specialist and burnout coach based in Orange, New South Wales. Thank you, Jo.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. I will start sharing my screen. Okay, great. Here we go. Okay, great to be here this evening with you all. I've got two parts to my talk that I'm going to give tonight, mainly around burnout in healthcare, and then we're going to finish on a bit around self-care in the healthcare workplace, and maybe that will be a point of discussion through the Q&A this evening. So my name's Jo. I am a rehabilitation physician working with the Midwestern Brain Injury Rehabilitation Program based out of Bathurst. I live in Orange with my husband and 3 young sons. I'm also a professional coach for healthcare workers, healthcare staff, with my niche being in burnout recovery and also burnout prevention. Last year, I was lucky enough to be, I think, the only rural participant for the New South Wales cohort of the Australian Clinical Entrepreneur Program, where I got to meet other healthcare innovators and learn how to, I guess, grow my business side of my business that I have in coaching. I love playing tennis. That is my de-stress point. I've had my own journey through burnout myself, and that's what brought me to upskilling as a coach and bringing this evidence-based, one of the many solutions that individuals might entertain for burnout recovery. So I won't go into my full story around that, but can talk about that at the end if that's of interest to you. So tonight, what I'd like to share with you is the brief overview of what I'm going to go through. We're going to go through what burnout looks like, how do you assess it, what are some of the subtypes of burnout, what are the protective factors in the workplace, and how to keep yourself well at work. Last week, I headed into Sydney for a one-day workshop with the organisational response to workplace wellbeing, held at the ICC at Darling Harbour, and that was a really great full-day workshop to attend, and I'll be dropping in some of the research that I heard about last week. Here are your learning objectives for the presentation this evening. So we're going to go through the symptoms of burnout, learn about the contributors to burnout, identify the subtypes of burnout. We're going to differentiate between what burnout might look like versus depression and impact in clinical care. I will talk about some different burnout assessment tools that are available, talk about practical evidence-based strategies to address burnout, and ways that you might like to add to your existing self-care toolkit. Okay, so I'm sure burnout is something that has been talked about in your workplace, something that you've heard about in like conferences and workshops as well. We know the rates are high here in Australia, with an article actually in the Medical Journal of Australia today talking about at least 50% of staff are burnt out at present. So if it's not you, it may well be somebody that you are working with. There are 5 main factors to burnout, to recognizing what burnout looks like. The most common one in healthcare professionals is this state of emotional exhaustion, where you really have that increased distance from your job. You just are a bit checked out. You're not as involved and as engaged with particularly your patients that you might be facing, as well as colleagues and staff that you're working with. People often develop a sense of cynicism relating to their job, a sort of helplessness and a hopelessness that anything is going to change. And they also notice that they're not as effective, they're not as productive as they once were before. 2 other factors, so those 3 are the original 1975 definitions around burnout. There are some more recent additions from Professor Gordon Parker from the University of Sydney. His team have noticed that cognitive dysfunction is also very prevalent in people with burnout. Now, how might that look? That might look like memory issues, focus on your task at hand, easily distracted by other things, just not really getting through what you used to get through. So that's tying in with that professional efficacy also. And people often say that they have a brain fog, which is potentially an element of that cognitive dysfunction. And finally, the element of insularity. So that can look like withdrawal from social situations, withdrawal from being so involved with your team as you might have done before. If you're a sole practitioner, you might notice that you just don't feel that you have energy in the tank or a willingness to connect with the people you used to connect with outside of work. It's an extra thing to do. You're feeling exhausted already, and that sort of additional human interaction may not be what you're looking for at that moment. So I've got a couple of slides now on burnout rates in Australia and burnout rates in healthcare providers. In Australia, from a study in 2022, there was about 62% of Australian workers reported being burned out at work, compared with a global average of about 48%, so a bit of a difference. Financially, burnout costs the Australian economy $14 billion per year, and that is probably 2 years old, that data that we've got there. Certainly in healthcare, burnout is a very expensive situation for the healthcare system, when we have sort of absenteeism, even presenteeism, and also staff attrition as a result of burnout, because often people will see quitting as the answer to escaping burnout. So this is why it is an important topic to discuss, not only at the maybe ground level, or the people who are more likely to be affected by burnout, but also at the management level and the executive level, because it's often easy to identify it and harder to manage it. But today I want to leave you with some tools how you as an individual and also at an organizational level can manage burnout. Okay, so what about burnout rates in healthcare and healthcare providers? Some studies, this is from New Zealand, the first 2 lines are from New Zealand. This was a study of senior medical workforce, doctors and dentists in hospitals, in public hospitals in New Zealand, published 2016. They found that women and younger doctors were at higher risk of burnout, and the 2 departments at the highest risk in that study were psychiatry and emergency department physicians. In a separate study that I learned about last week, nurse burnout correlated with how the patient satisfaction was at the hospital level. So we've seen this also in studies with doctors. When you have a burnt out clinician, they're not as engaged with their patient, and then the patient is not as engaged with the clinician, and sort of the engaging or adhering to recommendations by the clinician, those adherence rates drop down in the patients because of that lack of sort of engagement in the clinic space. So patient satisfaction and also patient adherence to recommendations, they're both affected. So let's go through 3 different zones of what you might notice in somebody who might be exhibiting some burnout symptoms, okay? I've divided these into physical, emotional, and behavioral signs. So there will be overlap with other conditions. You know, that is some of the nature of the variety of conditions that human beings can have. Here's some of the physical symptoms. Common features: headaches, stomach aches, fatigue, frequent illnesses, a change in appetite, a change in sleep. I see that often with my clients, waking up, feeling somewhat panicked, often at the early hours of the morning, somewhat agitated, often about the day ahead and what lies ahead for them. So that's some of the physical symptoms that we might notice there. Secondly, I've got some of the emotional symptoms. I mentioned some of these before. So we've got that helplessness and cynicism. There can also be a sense of failure or self-doubt. So we know that burnout occurs in people who are really highly qualified. So having a multitude of high-level qualifications is not a protective factor from burnout. It is actually a risk factor. And we know that many people in healthcare may have elements of imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon as well, where you're sort of doubting yourself, that you've got the skill set or the qualifications for the workplace. You're worried that somebody's going to come and tap you on the shoulder. So I think watching out for that sense of not good enough or self-doubt is another emotional symptom you might notice. Very much so decreased satisfaction with a career that might have been a real passion and something they really wanted to pursue, just not feeling that they're achieving their purpose anymore. Certainly feeling detached or alone in the world, and a loss of motivation. And I want to remind you that we can also see burnout certainly in medical students as well. Some of you may be involved with medical students in your practices, and the rates are very similar. So 50%, sometimes up to 75% of medical students showing burnout. And that really can impact on their learning that they need to do through medical school as well. So something to be mindful of there if you are a medical student educator. Finally, the behavioral signs that you might notice. This is where we talk about sort of the reduced professional efficacy. So you're not performing as well, you're not performing as quickly, things are slower than they used to be. Noticing that withdrawal or isolation, putting things off, not wanting to get on and get the task done. That's where that emotional symptom of sense of failure or self-doubt might be coming in. Having emotional outbursts and using a range of substances to cope. So from digital devices to other substances that people might use to cope there. Okay, so let's go through what some of the contributing factors might be. Again, I've divided this into 3 sections. We've got work-related first. So burnout in many of the definitions is related to the work environment that somebody is in. I would say, yes, it does from what I've seen, yes, it does contribute to the chance or the risk of burnout in an individual, but it's not only the workplace that contributes to burnout, because there's other factors I'm going to go through as well. And we certainly don't have 100% burnout rate in clinical care or in a hospital environment, fortunately. So here's some of the work-related contributing factors: a lack of control, a lack of agency over work, a lack of recognition. If you flip that on its head, if you're really proactive around recognizing the value and the contributions and the attributes that individuals have in a workplace. That can be a great burnout recovery strategy. Having overly demanding job expectations, having very monotonous work, or being in a chaotic or high pressure environment. You might be aware of the psychosocial hazards in the workplace. There's some new legislation that has come through earlier this year that this is just a handful of some of those psychosocial hazards in the workplace, which also includes harassment and bullying as well. That was a question we had in the July webinar. Secondly, we've got lifestyle-related factors that can contribute to burnout. Certainly working a lot of hours, which we know is asked of many clinicians at present due to staff shortages, without that sort of downtime to socialize, very important for us as human beings. A lack of connection is really more harmful to our health, a lack of human connection, than smoking or obesity or high blood pressure. So without getting that human to human connection or relaxing, this is a risk factor for burnout, a lack of close and supportive relationships, so many responsibilities, and not enough sleep. And finally, if you think about the personality of the kind of person that might be at risk of burnout, what comes to mind for you? Often these people have a very perfectionist tendency. So they can have a very much an all or nothing thinking. It's either this or it's that. It's never this and a bit of that. They're very high achieving in nature, type A kind of personality. They really want to be in control. So they're going to try and control the environment around them. And they may have a pessimistic view of the world rather than an optimistic view. So we've gone through the common symptoms or signs that you might see in somebody with burnout. We've now gone through contributing factors to burnout. I'm now going to go through 3 different subtypes of burnout. This evolved through some research done in Spain by some psychologists in about 2016. I think they did two lots of research. One lot was in general practitioners, and they identified these 3 subtypes. So let's go through these and be mindful of what you think might relate more to the healthcare provider. First of all, we've got overload burnout. So these are people who, what might you see? These are the symptoms you might see. They work harder and they work harder. If I apply myself more, surely I can solve this problem. Surely I can get out of this mess that I'm in, to the detriment of their own health and their personal life. The most common subtype of burnout that was noted, affecting highly dedicated employees. We can often see that in healthcare providers, people who are very committed to their workplace, to their patients who they may have seen for a number of years or decades. There can often be venting of emotions to others. So this is not necessarily naming and processing your feelings. It's more likely to be those emotional outbursts. And then these people who have that let's work harder approach may well jump to problem-solving mode. I can fix this. I'm really good at fixing things. That's what we do a lot of in healthcare, of course. People come to us with problems and we take it upon ourselves to solve their problems. So that's what they'll do to try and get through burnout. They'll try and fix it, often themselves, maybe not asking for help from anybody else. Secondly, we've got under-challenged burnout. So this is the opposite of the overloaded burnout. They're bored. They're not stimulated by their job. They feel underappreciated. They're frustrated. There is maybe a lack of learning opportunities. It's monotonous. It's the same. They lose passion and become cynical about the workplace that they're in, and they're really hungry for more challenging tasks. So you might consider that there might be people you're aware of in your workplace that might have this style of burnout. And finally, we've got a different style called neglect burnout. So this is the really worn out person. We know that we've got emotional exhaustion as a strong factor, the most common factor we might see in healthcare practitioners. these people feel helpless in the face of challenges. So something comes up that they have to do and they just can't see how they can get over the mountain or over the hill to the other side. There may be a lack of structure, direction, or guidance for them. When something comes up that doesn't go as planned, they just give up. So also to obstacles as well. So we've got overload burnout, under-challenged burnout, and neglect burnout. I'm going to go through solutions for them or approaches to address them shortly. I wanted now to talk about how do we know if this person has got burnout or if maybe they've got depression? And that's a question that comes up when I give these talks, and there is additional research that I learned about last week by Professor Tate Shanafelt and his team from the Mayo Clinic at Stanford University. So they did a study looking at the hypothesis, is burnout associated with increased suicidal ideation and self-reported medical errors among physicians after accounting for depression. So we know that the risk of or suicidal ideation is increased in medical healthcare practitioners. They also had a tool for self-reported medical errors. So this is still very much a subjective kind of report. They looked at over 1,300 US physicians in 2018 to 19. And they did this study adjusting for depression in the results that they had from this study. Adjusting for depression, they had no association with the increase in burnout and an increase in suicidal ideation. If there was a physician with depression, an increase in depression increased the odds of suicidal ideation. They did find that there was an increase in burnout associated with an increase in self-reported medical errors. And they found that depression is not associated with self-reported medical errors. So there was this diagram that Tate Shanafelt drew up, and you could see that there was not a strong correlation at all between burnout and depression. It was more depression increasing the odds of suicidal ideation and burnout increasing the odds of self-reported medical errors. Okay, so there's the reference for that. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple of tools that you could use to rate burnout. And you may well have been doing the People Matters and employee survey if you're part of an organization that's been inviting staff to do that recently. You will have seen that there are quite a few questions around burnout in there. There are a handful of different burnout tools, including the Maslach Burnout Inventory, MBI. I would suggest that it would also be prudent to do a DAS, and I know several other coaches who coach in this space. They will also do a screening DAS on commencing work with a healthcare client. I have a tool that I have on my website. This is a research-based tool from Belgium. The QR code is there, and we can add that at the end in the notes that you'll get. It has 3 sort of outcomes that you can have from the burnout assessment tool. You're either not at risk, or at very high risk. And this is asking 12 brief questions looking around cognitive function, interpersonal relationships, and sort of efficacy as well. And then in this book, which I do highly recommend, this is Burnout, written by Professor Gordon Parker, who I mentioned from the University of Sydney. They have a questionnaire at the back of that book as well. So there is no one standardized burnout assessment tool that anybody uses in particular. I just wanted to offer you some different ones there, some which are online and some are in print. Okay, so we've now gone through the lion's share about the facts about burnout. Let's now talk about some of the recovery strategies that can be used. So what I learned last week, this is the short version of what I learned last week. to add on top of what I already know about this area, I guess, is if you're in an organization, how to address burnout. 80% of how to address it lies within the organization. So that is a really important area to focus on. And the individual also, 20% of the recovery is around how the individual is, being responsible for themselves and what they're doing to actively maintain themselves well and out of burnout. So 3 areas were really important in the organizational level, looking at leadership. So we talked about sort of middle management, and that the impact of managers on individual units can have an impact on whether there'll be more or less burnout in the next 2 years. So that leadership really matters there. Targeted interventions relate to different departments need different strategies. So, in a hospital, there can be multiple different departments. Even in the community, there'll be a lot of different departments there. And it's important to think about what are the best, most specific strategies for each unit to improve their efficacy. So yes, this is talking around scheduling, electronic health records, sort of interfaces that are easier or harder for clinicians to use. So what would work specifically in your unit that you're working in? And that sense of community at work. So there was another study that they did and found that when physicians were either offered connection with other physicians as a burnout recovery strategy, like a regular dose of an hour or 2 hours of connecting, talking about physicianhood, compared with extra time to complete admin tasks, the physicians that had that community aspect recovered from burnout faster. The ones that had extra admin time, it didn't have an impact on their burnout recovery. So from an individual point of view, it's great to have objective measures to start with. At the conference last week, they were definitely talking about the wellbeing index, which is something you might want to look up, comes out of Stanford. And once clinicians are more aware of where they are on a scale, they can move from that pre-contemplation to contemplation to actively doing something about it to maintenance. 3 areas that an individual could work on are: what are their values, and are they actually aligned with the organization or the group that they're working with? We'll talk about meaning shortly, and also the evidence base behind professional coaching. So I'm briefly going to go through this Stanford model of professional fulfillment. This is, again, it's not quite 20% to 80%. It's been divided into thirds here, but you can see in red, that is what is the organization's responsibility, and in blue, it's the individual's responsibility there. And they're saying that all these 3 parts contribute to an individual having more professional fulfillment. Okay, so mindful of time, I'm going to keep moving on, but you can ask me questions about that later if you'd like to. I've now got a handful of different ways to reduce your risk of burnout, and these are also tools that can be used to recover from burnout. So firstly, let's go through what is meaningful to you. So this was a study from quite a while back in 2009. They surveyed doctors and invited them to share what is meaningful for them in the workplace. And I think that might be a question that's just dropped into the chat now. Have a think. What is something that you do on the regular that really feels meaningful to you? I've had clinicians say, getting to the bottom of a diagnosis in ED while the patient's still in D. Somebody else really likes doing certain procedures, and that feels very meaningful to them. So I would invite you to think about what are meaningful activities for you, and through your working week, would 20% or more of your time be doing those meaningful activities? Because this is a burnout recovery strategy with evidence behind it. Okay, then here's some more evidence-based tools to recover from burnout. So mindfulness and meditation are included in here. One that I like to share with clients is a 5-sense awareness. That might be something you're aware of. What can you see, hear, touch, smell, and taste? So you're just going through your 5 senses there. Meditation in whatever form that might be for you, whether it's a walking meditation, whether it's lying down with your legs up the wall, or it's sitting in quiet time, either on your own or group meditation. Definitely exercise is a great tool for that stress discharge. So, you know, burnout can be thought of as a build up of many paper cuts or micro traumas in the workplace. So how can we help our body feel, our body and our brain feel safe, feel like the stress has been discharged? Is exercise something that you like? Is movement something that you like that you can do after a day in the potentially stress-inducing environment that you go into on the daily? And finally, there are quite a few published articles around coaching. This is one article here. I met these medical researchers last year when I went to the US. They trialed a 6-month group coaching program randomized for residents. So some got some paperwork, sort of some written supporting material, and the others got, I think, 2 hours per week of group coaching that they could join in and watch, or they could volunteer to be coached. They could raise their hand to be coached, and there was a decrease in the emotional exhaustion scale at the end of 6 months. There was an improvement, or there was like a decrease in the imposter syndrome, and I think there was an improvement in professional efficacy, sort of as the individual grades that as well. There are other researchers that have also done quite a lot of evidence around coaching for burnout as well. So we've got that as 4 evidence-based tools. Now we're going to go through the 3 subtypes of burnout and what might work as a recovery strategy here. So with overload burnout, you remember you've got the person that's trying to fix everything. They're going to work harder. It's the most common subtype of burnout. This is 2 different things that you could trial for the person with overload burnout. So growing your emotional awareness is a great strategy. I often go through this with clients. Learn how to regulate your emotions more, name and process your feelings, reframe your negative self-talk, and think about the parts that you maybe do enjoy in your life and how that's helping you over the long term. So emotional granularity has got good amounts. So that means having a good vocabulary of your emotions. That's got some great research behind it there. And remember, these people are really driven by being in the workplace, solving problems, and maybe their productivity relates to them in terms of their self-worth. So how can you separate out your self-worth so that you can wake up in the morning and have your own self-worth? I'm good enough, without having to do any work, without having to do anything productive. So think about your identity in work and outside of work as well. Secondly, we've got the under-challenged person in burnout. With these people, they are hungry for a challenge. They want to have something that's going to pep them up and stretch them a bit more than what's been going on in their under-challenging workplace. So why not set a goal to learn a new skill or to develop, upgrade in some way over the next 30 days? Start small, keep it realistic, and make strides towards something that is fun. Oh, and here we've got that word meaningful coming in again. So really identify what you like in your role that you have in the workplace. And then finally, neglect burnout is the 3rd subtype. So this is the person that doesn't feel like they have any control. They're quite pessimistic in the workplace. They're feeling helpless. And if they have a big obstacle to get over, they and they can't get past that, they'll stop trying. So here it's great to find ways to regain agency. You're not going to be able to have control over everything, but where can you have some agency? What about creating a to-don't list? So we know about to-do lists. What are the things you're not going to be doing? What can you outsource? Where can you say no? How are your boundaries going? Who can support you? How can you support yourself to set stronger boundaries? Where do you feel resentment and when? What can you control? And bring some routines into your work. Okay, so another part of burnout recovery, which I think is so very important, is dropping the stigma around asking for help. We're all humans here. Nobody's superhuman. We all have different needs that people might not know about if we don't speak up. I hope that everybody here on the call has got their own primary healthcare service that they go to. Let's reduce that stigma in asking for help and support each other. Normalize that 1 in 2 people currently at least have burnout in healthcare in Australia. Here are some resources that I just like to add while I'm giving my presentation before we go into the next section. Okay, so then that's the summary of the first half of the talk. I'm now going to go into the self-care part of the talk, and maybe there will be more discussion around this. Then we'll have some time for Q&A. Okay, so I'm imagining that you've already got some part to your self-care program. So this is part of the individual approach to burnout recovery or burnout prevention as well. What does that look like for you? Self-care is the practice of taking an active role in protecting one's own well-being, particularly during periods of stress. That's one definition that I found. There can be lots of different pillars of self-care. Here are some that you might think about: physical, social, mental, spiritual, and emotional. And so why is having a self-care plan important? There are lots of different benefits. I'm sure you can think of a few. It's a great way to improve mental health and well-being, manage stress and anxiety, to prevent illness, maximize productivity, and enhance personal relationships. And you can see that there's quite an overlap there with what we notice in an individual in burnout who's got stress maybe that's not being managed. They're waking up agitated or with feelings of anxiousness. They have more frequent illnesses. Their productivity might be down and they're feeling slightly insular. So I think this is a great segue to go through after talking about burnout. Let's go through some key aspects of self-care, going through those different pillars that I just mentioned earlier. Some physical ones can be getting outside, a movement way to discharge that stress from your body. Again, I'm highlighting here the importance of having healthcare provider checkups. How is your sleep hygiene? How is your support of yourself of an evening to turn off devices and remind your body in a routine to be getting ready for bed and having a balanced diet? Secondly, how about mental self-care? So I often go through the inner critic versus the inner fan or the inner champion with my clients. How is that inner narrative for you? Is that a person with a sense of failure or self-doubt? Or are you backing yourself and knowing that failure comes with success? And so we get through the failures and pick up and keep going. Here we've got connecting with others again. I talked about that earlier as some of the evidence behind that as a great burnout recovery strategy. Have a think on this Zoom call this evening. Who would you like to reach out to? Who would you like to send a message to? You can set some goals in whatever size you want, but I often suggest sort of reasonable, realistic, not too big, and then you can be getting those dopamine hits along the way. Break down the goals to all the steps that you have to take, and before you know it, you'll have like 5 different steps under your belt, and that will help you keep going. Putting your phone down, learning something new, and really practicing self-compassion as well. That helps with the approach that we're all humans in this healthcare world. And we know that the 3 parts of self-compassion are the common humanity, mindfulness, and kindness as well. Okay. Some of the emotional self-care approaches could be meditation and mindfulness. Both of them are evidence-based for burnout recovery. Journaling, so that can be writing down all the thoughts that you have in your mind, offloading the activity, the brain busyness that you might notice, and getting it down on paper. Do with it what you want. Gratitude has definitely got evidence behind that as well. What 3 things might you be grateful for today? Lots of different sorts of breath work that you may be aware of already, and sharing acts of kindness. Okay, the final pillar that I've done here is professional. So are you getting all your allocated leave? This can tie in with burnout, with the workplace. Does anybody cover me if I'm away? Does my work all stack up if I go away? So I come back from my holiday and go, oh, there's still so much to do. But, you know, we're all allocated leave, and it's important to take that leave for ourselves. Think about those meaningful activities at work. Again, we've talked about this before. Be clear on your boundaries and how healthy are those boundaries. How is your boundary between the workplace and out of work for you? What are your expectations? Would you like to be a mentor to somebody in your workplace? Okay, so finally, I think if you're becoming aware of what's existing for your self-care plan and what you'd like to add to it, see what your current setup is. What are you currently doing? What are your positive and negative habits you use to deal with stress? Okay, so see what your baseline is, see what your strategies are. Identify what your needs are. What would you like to add to or change around in your self-care practice currently? Is it something in the physical, emotional, professional, mental, spiritual domain? Who would you reach out to? What are your goals? And here's some more questions that might just invite you to have a moment to ponder what would be supportive for you now. You know, it's quite a peak time in the year of busyness. We're just rounding out term 3, and there's plenty on with kids. If you're a parent and you've got little people who you're supporting in their education, yeah, I'm sure the workplace is also busy as well, and there may be other things going on too. So just take a pause and think about some of these questions. What makes you feel energized? That's what sometimes people in burnout are lacking, that energy. So what does make you feel energized? When do you feel at peace? What makes you feel fulfilled? And who has helped me before? So you've identified some of your needs. You've checked in with what your self-care plan looks like currently. So then if you want to add something in, how often is that going to be? How long does that go for? Is it a short gratitude practice before you go to bed? Is it some stretches or movement that you want to do in the morning? And then evaluate how it's going, because if we don't evaluate, we don't know if the change we've made is working or not. I love this weekly evaluation tool. I use it for my whole week rather than just for a self-care plan. What went well? What didn't go well? And from that, what would I do differently? This is coming from a place of curiosity. It's not judgment. I haven't done things wrong. I'm just observing what did go well and what didn't go well. So that might be helpful. 3 questions you might want to use. And remember, we talked about that sort of neglect burnout. Those people might see an obstacle and that stops them from getting started. What about you? Can you see any obstacles or maybe negative habits that stop you from getting started? What might need to change? What needs to shift? So we're closing out now. It might be nice if you would like to discuss more as healthcare professionals discussing around self-care strategies. I've got this final slide that I'd like to invite you to think about if this presentation has invited you to make any changes, and why is it important to make that change? What will happen if you do not make the change, and what will be the flow-on effects if you do make change? It's been my absolute pleasure to be with you this evening. You can find me online on social media at the Burnout Recovery or Burnout Recovery Doctor. That's my website, Dr. Jo Braid. I've got a podcast which is nearly 1 year old. And if you've got any questions, you're welcome to send them to me. hello@drjobraid.com. Thank you so much. Okay, let's have a look in the chat box. Okay, thanks. Okay, so if you've got some questions, please pop them in the Q&A. I think Lauren maybe asked about what is meaningful to people in the workplace, what's something you feel proud or happy about, and what is a key takeaway for you in this presentation. As I'd like to say, there are no right or wrong answers or questions here. You're very welcome. I want this to be a safe space that you feel you can have a chat and you know, share learnings or share what's working for you. Thanks. So sometimes I get asked around burnout and depression, but I have explained that already in the talk earlier today. What else comes up? We sometimes talk around solo practitioners as well and how they can support themselves too. So I think it's great to have really clear boundaries of when you are in the workplace and when you're like switched off, when you're not in the workplace and you are out of there and you're not at anybody's beck and call. Think about who your, you know, point of help, point of contact, next person you'd reach out to if you wanted to have a connect, have a brainstorm through things. What are the self-care practices that you enjoy and that are priorities for you as well? And another tool that I often use with clients is to list your achievements and list them on the regular. They can be really good for growing that sense of self-worth and growing your inner validation rather than seeking any external validation, which might be more restricted for you if you are in a solo practice. Okay, thanks so much for that. I have problems trying to motivate people to make that change. Any tips? Okay. So this is working with people in burnout and trying to get them to make change. I guess motivation or willpower can sometimes only go for so long. Sometimes we can run out of that. I would inquire as to why, like why, you know, why is the reason, why do they want to change where they are? Why do they want to be out of this, you know, rock bottom zone that they might be in burnout? Because I think one of the differences I've found in coaching and being a clinician as well is that there's so much more personal responsibility that a client might have than a patient might have. So, you know, how is this person in front of you going to take on that personal responsibility and, in a way, accountability to themselves, so they're not dependent on anybody else with who they're reporting into. They're actually doing this for themselves with accountability to themselves. So I hope that's a few little suggestions as to how to really get them engaged so that they're investing in themselves. Thanks so much for your feedback. Thanks for commenting there, Annabelle. That's great. Yeah. Yeah, plenty of different things on the podcast. I've had some really great guests that I've invited onto the podcast, some leaders in the healthcare space here in Australia and international as well. So you can look out for some solo episodes and also ones with guests as well. Okay, so they want to change but feel helpless or stuck in a rut. Sometimes something has to give before they choose to enact self-help strategies. Okay, yeah. So they're still, I don't often use this, but there are sort of 12 stages of burnout, and you can definitely see, I hear you, that there's a part where they're helpless and they have no sort of get up and go in themselves to change anything at that moment. And I think even accepting and acknowledging that that's where they're at without blame or pointing the finger or anything like that, just sort of, okay, this is where you're at, let's check in again soon and see when you are ready to do something about it. As a coach, I definitely screen people before I coach them, and I look for a sliver of growth mindset in them before we actually engage and start working together, because I hear you, if that helplessness is there and they can't see that anything can be different, that is one of the questions that I ask them: how could life be different in the next 3 to 6 months? If there's nothing there at that moment, that maybe isn't the time to get started with coaching, something with a growth mindset approach, something that's very future focused. So yeah, I would say check in again before long and see how they're progressing. You could always invite them to do a burnout assessment tool, one of the many ones that are available. These kind of tools can be used sort of quarterly to see how you're progressing through the year. You can repeat them again. Certainly the wellbeing index from Stanford is structured to be repeated as well, and then you can monitor yourself over time with regards to your well-being.